opioid addiction is something an individual is going to struggle with for the rest of their life.
Now, I don't want to go too in depth about this, but you talked about how you were originally dealing with heroin. Have you seen studies that suggest that a percentage of today's heroin users started with something else?
Yes, so there are studies, I think the statistic is 4 out of 5 heroin users began with prescription opioids. If you look, though, specifically at people who became opioid addicted post 1995, it's probably more than 4 out of 5. The vast majority of people who have become opioid addicted since 1995 became opioid addicted taking prescription opioids.
Okay. Now, so we're talking about 2003, 2005, and 6. At some point, did you start researching where all this addiction was coming from? I think you've told me you looked at a paper that Len Palazzi had written.
Yeah, so I was very well aware that we had a new serious opioid crisis. I was, as I mentioned, well aware that overdose deaths involving prescription opioids were increasing and that many people were becoming opioid addicted. The cause, though, for this sharp increase in addiction and overdose deaths was not totally clear to me until a paper was published in 2006 by Dr. Len Palazzi, a medical director at the CDC. Len was responsible for accidental deaths in the United States. And in the early 2000s, Dr. Palazzi starts to see that poisoning deaths in the US are going up rapidly. And he recognizes that if the trend continues, more Americans will die from poisoning than from a car crash, that poisoning death will become the #1 cause of accidental death. The #1 cause of accidental death for decades had been car crashes. That trend, by the way, did continue, and poisoning deaths did soon surpass car crashes as the #1 cause of accidental death. It took Len really only a few minutes to figure out that these poisoning deaths were prescription opioid overdoses because the CDC has the death certificate data. So the next thing that Len had to do was to figure out, well, why are so many Americans suddenly dying of prescription opioid overdoses? Why is this really taking off? And to answer that question, Len did something pretty neat. He obtained ARCOS data, basically a prescription opioid consumption data, sales data, and he looked at opioid sales, and he looked at prescription opioid overdoses, and what he found was that the deaths had increased directly in parallel with the increase in opioid prescribing. And what he wrote in his paper is that the reason the United States is experiencing a soaring increase in prescription opioid overdoses is because of a change in the way that the medical community has been treating pain. That we have become too aggressive, I think that's the word he used in his paper, in our prescribing of opioids, and that's what's causing this crisis. And when I read that, everything really began to make sense, and I began to think about some of my own medical education in which I had been encouraged to prescribe opioids aggressively.
So this was in the 2006 timeframe?
This is 2006.
It just dawned on me when you were talking about this idea that prescriptions go up, supply goes up, and death goes up. We've seen a lot of that in this case, haven't we?
We have.
You saw Claire Wynn testify about that very thing here in Oklahoma.
That's right.
I'm going to object. I'm not sure the purpose of that question and answer for qualifying Dr. Kolodny as an expert, just sort of rehashing evidence that's already been in the case so far.
Your Honor, if I may respond, this is not only an expert witness, he may be the preeminent fact witness in this entire country on the origins of the opioid crisis and their effect. And I'm just going through a predicate to get to all the qualifications he had. So I can move on.
And Your Honor, I have no objection to asking about his experience. He's been testifying to that. That's certainly pertinent, I think. But just asking him about testimony other witnesses gave in this case, I don't think serves any purpose. So I would object to that.
Question overruled, but I'd like you to get to his qualifications.
You bet, Your Honor. So as you go through this, and to point about your qualifications, one of the things you're going to talk about is the role of these KOLs and advocacy groups, right?
Yes.
So when you were dealing with this paper, did you see and start having experience with PPSG and Scott Fishman?
Yeah.
What happened?
So that paper really opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to what was fueling this sharp increase in addiction and overdose deaths, very aggressive prescribing. But it also opened my eyes because after, and that I think it was the same journal where Dr. Palazzi published this paper, his paper was attacked. There was a commentary that appeared in that same journal written by the Wisconsin Pain and Policy Study Group. I believe it was Jorgensen and Gilson may have been the co-author. And there was also a letter to the editor, I believe, in the same journal by Scott Fishman, a key opinion leader. They were not happy with Dr. Palazzi's paper, and in the arguments that they made attacking the paper were that by saying it's pain management practices fueling the crisis, that Dr. Palazzi is going to scare doctors from prescribing opioids and will make the untreated pain problem worse. And they also said, how does Dr. Palazzi know that it's not theft from pharmacies or illicit opioids? How does he know it's the prescription opioids, which reminded, when I was listening to the cross-examination of Clara Wynn, Johnson & Johnson seemed to be making the same argument that the Wisconsin Pain and Policy Study Group made.
I think he's going beyond the question that was asked. It's non-responsive, and it's just trying to regurgitate evidence that's already been presented.
I can address that. So let's save some of the opinions for a moment.
Okay.
We're going to spend some time this morning talking about your extensive background and research leading up to those opinions. So
okay.
Let me ask you this. Did you at some point in continuing your research and background qualifications to be here today, did you send a FOIA request to PPSG to get information about their funding?
Yeah, so it was certainly disturbing to see Len's paper attacked because to me we had really the answer to what was causing so many deaths, and to see an effort to try and discredit this, the paper and the argument in the paper was concerning. It was not hard to figure out that the authors of these papers had some financial ties to opioid manufacturers.
So let's stop there for a second. We're going to get into those ties. I think the point here is that as you're seeing these problems where you're working, were you investigating and researching what you believe to be were the origins of some of these problems?
Yes.
And did you also go meet with Len Palazzi and start talking with Len about the evidence that he had and what was going on?
Yeah, so I invited Dr. Palazzi. At this point I was working at a hospital, and I invited him to give a grand rounds lecture at the hospital on the opioid crisis, and I met with him for lunch after the grand rounds to talk with him more about the opioid crisis, what was fueling it, as well as the involvement of front groups and key opinion leaders in interfering with efforts to bring the crisis under control.
Okay, so let's carry forward. From then to 2007, you're continuing this research and investigation, right?
Yes.
And at some point, did you attend a conference that Dr. Russell Portnoy had convened?
Yes, I did. I think it was 2007. Dr. Portnoy had been hosting an annual conference on pain and chemical dependency. That was the title of his conference, and I think the idea was that the conference would cover both the problem of pain and the problem.
Hear lectures about a concept called opiophobia?
Yes, it was in the keynote speech. It was used over and over again, the term opiophobia.
Let me ask you this, was Jorgensen there?
Yes, Jorgensen, I think it's David Jorgensen, gave a talk, and I think he was given an award, a humanitarian award, for his work at the Wisconsin Pain and Policy Study Group.
Okay, so while you're doing this background work and learning about what's going on, 2006 or so, you go to a new place called Maimonides. Did I say that right?
Yes, Maimonides.
What is that?
That's a New York City hospital.
Okay. It's a medical center in Brooklyn?
That's right. It's one of the largest community-based teaching hospitals in the country.
Okay. And what I think you've told me before, they have a huge ER department. Is that right?
They do. We have one of the. I'm not there anymore. They have one of the busiest emergency rooms in the country.
Okay. And you became the vice chair of the Department of Psychiatry. Is that right?
That's correct.
And at some point, did you become the chair?
Yes, I did. I think 3 years after I became chair.
And there, did you do clinical work?
Yes, so I did clinical work and I supervised clinical work. So when I came in as vice chair, I was vice chair for clinical services. So I worked in and supervised the psychiatric treatment in our emergency room, our outpatient programs, and our inpatient units.
Okay. And at some point, you then left to go to Phoenix House in 2013. What is that?
Phoenix House is a national nonprofit addiction treatment agency. They're in several states, or they were in several states. I think they've gotten a little smaller.
And you had become the chief medical officer there in New York?
They hired me, yes, to be the chief medical officer for the national organization, and their headquarters were based in New York City.
And at some point in that same time frame, 2013 to 2016, did you also get involved with something called Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing?
That was a little earlier. That was around 2010 when PROP, Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, first began to form.
Okay, let's talk about that just a little bit. Did you ever come across problems in your practice and your clinical experience where you were seeing mental health patients getting sent to pain doctors?
Yes. The Joint Commission had mandated, basically the Joint Commission, which sets the rules for hospitals, a hospital that wants to be able to bill Medicare needs to pass its Joint Commission accreditation. It needs that accreditation. And if you can't bill Medicare, I don't think you can exist as a hospital. So their rules are critically important. I believe in 2001, the Joint Commission mandated that hospitals treat pain like a vital sign. And that mandate went beyond patients who may have just come out of surgery, where it might make sense, where it does make sense to ask them if they feel pain and to ask them about their pain. It extended to every patient in a hospital, even if they were there for a condition that's not painful. And it extended to the outpatient programs for hospitals. The way it worked at Maimonides, even a mental health clinic, if you came into the mental health clinic because you were depressed or anxious and you wanted to sit down with a therapist, before you could sit down with the therapist, we had to show you the smiley faces and the frowny faces and get your pain score from 1 to 10. And if somebody circled the frowny face indicating physical pain, the hospital policy read refer to pain management. And of course, when that patient got to pain management, you could take a pretty good guess at what they might get a prescription for. Our hospital was even cited by the Joint Commission for not screening pain in children who were coming into the mental health clinic.
Now, at some point, you got involved in PROP. We just discussed that. I don't want to get into a huge, long dissertation about that at this point, but can you give the court high-level overview of what PROP is and why you got involved in it?
Sure. So, myself and a few other physicians, probably many, but physicians were recognizing what was happening. Not many were going to speak out about it, or maybe, it was sort of, I think it reminds me of the story about the emperor has no clothes on. I think there were many doctors who recognized that this practice is harming patients. This makes no sense to prescribe a highly addictive drug for common everyday pain. But it was difficult to speak out against that because it had become so accepted. Myself and a few other physicians and researchers around the country had begun speaking about it or writing papers about it. And we found each other through our work and began, we started to schedule conference calls. We were, to discuss how do we begin to change what's happening. But it was also almost a support group because we were also so frustrated with what was happening. One of the first things that we decided to do before we had even began to form PROP or become an organization, we put together a 4-page educational document. We wanted it to be very brief. And what we were doing with this educational material for prescribers was explicitly correcting some of the misinformation that was leading to overprescribing. So for example, on the document, it stated that opioids have not been proven safe and effective for long-term use. Opioids are highly addictive. Physiological dependence on opioids sets in within a few days of regular use, those types of messages. We called the document Cautious and Evidence-Based Opioid Prescribing. And the authors of this document, we had good reputations in our respective fields. So some of us were pain specialists, some of us were internal medicine, addiction, public health. And but once we had finished drafting that document, we found other clinicians and researchers with even better reputations to also put their name on the document as referees. And when we had finished the document, we then were interested in beginning to try and disseminate it. And we reached out to our professional societies to ask them to co-brand the document and to help with dissemination. And some of us were even on the boards of our respective professional societies, and yet we were only able to get one professional society that was willing to co-brand it. That was the American College of Medical Toxicology, the doctors that treat overdoses in emergency rooms. And so that was when we began to think we may need to form our own organization. And I think
Did you reach out to the American Pain Society?
We did. We didn't think that we stood much chance of having them co-branded, but we did ask them. And for the American Pain Society and the American Academy of Pain Medicine, we didn't expect that they were going to co-brand this because they were pushing at the same time messages that were still very harmful. But for some of the other professional societies, we thought we'd stand a chance. And I think that the reason that they were not willing...
I'm going to object. I think we're getting beyond qualifications here, and it also sounds like we're getting into hearsay that really doesn't relate to the qualifications of the witness.
I can handle that. We're going to get to your opinions. There'll be a lot of them. Let's just keep to the factual background at this point. So as you're dealing with this, you're investigating what you believe is a public health issue, right?
That's correct.
You're in real life, you're investigating and researching all that's going on, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so as this time frame kind of moves forward, In 2012, did the Senate Finance Committee work with you at all to deal with any of this?
Yes, so I think in 2000, beginning in 2011, I think probably spring 2011, an article appeared in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel about the Wisconsin Pain and Policy Study Group and how the organization was taking millions of dollars from opioid manufacturers and interfering with efforts to bring the opioid crisis under control and promoting aggressive prescribing in states across the country. And shortly after, in a different news outlet, another investigative journalist did a story about the American Pain Foundation. This was Charles Ornstein writing for ProPublica, and that piece was picked up by newspapers across the country. And so that caught the attention of Senator Grassley and Senator Baucus.
And so did they ask you to come and be involved in any investigation they were doing?
Yes, so when they launched their investigation, the lead staffer on the investigation asked me to help.
Okay. And did you do that?
Yes, I did.
Now, again, let's not get into too much detail about the findings, but have you also done work investigating the Joint Commission and also something called HCAPS, HCAPS?
Not really. I mean, I did some investigating or research really on and a review of the materials that the Joint Commission had disseminated, materials that were funded by Johnson & Johnson and Purdue, but mainly with the Joint Commission and HCAPS, I was involved in advocacy. So,
can you tell the court what HCAPS is?
HCAPS is a survey that patients get after they leave a hospital. And the idea behind the survey is that the quality of care should be measured in part by a patient's experience in a hospital, and which I think makes some sense. When that survey was designed and they were trying to decide what should go onto the survey as a measure of the quality of care in hospitals, a decision was made, and a decision I believe influenced, a decision was made to include questions about pain. And so the survey asks people who've left hospitals, did you feel you needed medicine for pain during your hospital stay? If they say no, the survey just goes on to the next question. If they say yes, they're asked 2 follow-up questions, more or less, did you get that medicine every time you could have possibly needed it? And so that survey, the results are used to determine a hospital's reimbursement rate from Medicare. So that if a patient left a hospital and on the survey indicated that they didn't get the pain medicine when they wanted it, that hospital would be financially penalized. And PROP began hearing from doctors across the country that administrators were encouraging aggressive prescribing because the hospitals didn't want to be financially penalized.
Let's stop there for just a second. So we'll get into the details of that, but you investigated and researched what you believed were to be the facts surrounding that and some of the impact, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's kind of skip forward a little bit. You've heard us talk about Tasmania a few times. Have you ever been to Tasmania?
I have been to Tasmania.
You have?
Yes.
Can you tell the court about that?
So I was very interested in visiting Tasmania because I wanted to see where all of the opioids that were flooding into the United States were coming from. I knew that they were coming from Tasmania. I was aware that Tasmanian alkaloids was the major exporter of opium into the United States. And so I was eager to go and see what was happening there.
So you had, if I remember you telling me this, you had a speaking engagement in Melbourne, Australia, is that right?
That's correct. I was invited to give a talk at an international addiction conference in Melbourne, and Tasmania is an island just south of Melbourne, so I used that as my opportunity to visit Tasmania.
And so we'll talk later about Aramco and Tasmanian alkaloids and what you know about that. But while you were there, did you have a chance to talk to anybody that had been associated with Tasmanian alkaloids?
Before I went to Tasmania, I reached out to Tasmanian alkaloids. I believe I sent an email to their managing director asking if I could visit the facility and meet with him. I think the response I got back was, we'll let you know in a few days. And when I did hear back from Tasmanian alkaloids, they said no. It was pretty clear they didn't want me to visit their facility, and they were not willing to meet with me. And I think it's because at that time they had a sense that I'd been speaking out about overprescribing of opioids. And so I did reach out, though, to the former managing director of Tasmanian alkaloids, Mr. Brian Hartnett. He ran Tasmanian alkaloids for, I think, more than 30 years. He was there when Johnson & Johnson purchased Tasmanian alkaloids. And so I spent a day with him learning the history of Tasmanian alkaloids and Johnson & Johnson's role with Tasmanian alkaloids.
Okay. And again, let's not get into a lot of detail about that, but did you learn quite a bit about Tasmanian alkaloids while you were there?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So let's kind of focus on some of your consulting work that you've done. Well, let's go back to Tasmanian alkaloids. Had you met me or anybody associated with our legal team at that point?
No, this was a few years before I'd ever met you.
We didn't tell you to go there.
Nobody told me to go there.
Okay. So you, over the last 4 or 5 years, have you also been engaged in working as a consultant or witness for different government organizations dealing with the opioid crisis?
Yes.
Okay. And we're going to talk about some of those here in a minute, but I just want to go back to the advocacy group issue for a moment and these KOLs. We talked about Joranson and a few of the others a second ago. Without getting into what you think they did, have you done extensive research and investigation on your own into the funding that those groups had received and the kind of information that they had put out into the marketplace?
Yes, I've done my own research and I've assisted other investigators.
Okay, thank you. So let's go and talk about some of the different things that you've done around the opioid crisis. You have done research on conflicts of interest and opioid prescribing. And is there a paper you were involved in that was cited by the President's Commission on Combating the Drug Addiction and Opioid Crisis?
Yes.
Okay. And I don't want to go into a detail about that real quick, but let's just look at it. Mr. Medina, can you pull up States Exhibit 1574 at pages 0020, please? It's already in evidence. And if we could go, if you'll see page footnote 15, I think is on the next page. And that goes on and talks about organizations with funding from opioid manufacturers, than those without funding from the life sciences industry. You see that?
Yes.
Okay, if we could go to 0126, Mr. Medina. You can blow out footnote 15. We see there Lynn, Lucas, Murimi, and Kolodny, and others. Do you see that?
Yes.
And that is a paper that you wrote?
Yes.
And
I
what's-
was a co-author.
Okay, and what's that called?
Financial Conflicts of Interest and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's 2016 Guideline for Prescribing Opioids for Chronic Pain.
Can you give the court just a high-level overview of what that paper was about?
Yes, we looked at opposition to the introduction of the CDC guideline, and there had been a federal docket opened when the CDC was introducing its guideline. And so we looked at comments that were submitted to that docket and to see whether or not there was a relationship between organizations opposed to the release of the CDC guideline or content in the guideline, and a relationship between opposition to the guideline and funding from opioid manufacturers. And we did find that relationship.
And if you look at footnote 14 there, you see in the White House Commission, it discusses the United States Senate Committee on Finance website, and it discusses the Baucus-Grassley issue of opioid manufacturers' ties to medical groups.
Yes.
Okay, is that what you were referring to earlier, where you worked with one of the committee investigators for Senator Baucus and Grassley?
Yes.
Okay, so let's turn forward now. In 2014, did you have an opportunity to serve as an expert witness for the United States Senate caucus on international narcotics control?
I did.
Was that a dealing with deceptive or alleged deceptive marketing?
It was a hearing on the opioid crisis, and my testimony did discuss this campaign to encourage aggressive opioid prescribing that relied on deceptive information.
Have you had an opportunity to consult and provide information to the United States Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee regarding the marketing of opioids and the opioid crisis?
I did testify for the Homeland Security Committee about the opioid crisis. I can't recall if my testimony included a discussion of marketing.
Okay. Have you also worked with the United States Senate Committee on Energy and Commerce, and specifically the subcommittee on health with the United States House of Representatives?
Yes, I think it was last year that I testified for House Energy and Commerce on the opioid crisis, and I think I'm pretty sure I did discuss aggressive marketing and misinformation about opioids.
From time to time, have you been asked to work with different congressional offices in the United States Congress to help them address or investigate these issues?
Yes, staffers in congressional offices often reach out to me.
Dr. Kolodny, have you had an opportunity to speak with the World Health Organization or actually go to Switzerland to deal with that?
I did. I was invited to speak at the World Health Organization about our opioid addiction epidemic.
Have you ever had an opportunity to work with or speak with the National Governors Association?
Yes, on a couple of occasions. I believe at a conference in Kentucky, and I believe last year I spoke at the National Governors Association spring meeting.
And the National Governors Association, as far as I understand, that's a bipartisan group of governors here in the United States?
Yes, this was bipartisan.
Okay. Have you ever worked with the National Association of Attorneys General regarding the opioid crisis?
Yes, I helped that association in the development of, I think it was actually working on prescribing guidance.
What about something called the National Judicial Opioid Task Force?
Yes, I think I met with them last year about the opioid crisis, and I gave a presentation, and I've met with some of their members since.
And did that include something called the National Center for State Courts?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Now, we see the paper here about the CDC. Were you or part of a stakeholder review group when the CDC did the guidelines for prescribing opioids for chronic pain in 2016?
Yes, PROP was one of the organizations that received a draft of the guideline and was asked to provide CDC with feedback.
And those guidelines actually cite you, correct?
I don't know that they cite us, but we're mentioned, we're listed on the guidelines.
Okay. Now, in addition to these consulting and investigatory work for different regulatory agencies, you also lecture around the country, is that true?
I do.
You lecture at places like Harvard, University of Chicago, University of Pennsylvania, and others?
Yes,
And we'll get to this in a moment, but you've lectured here in this state as well, correct?
I have.
Okay. What is the National Judicial Opioid Task Force?
It's, I think it's, trying to remember, I believe it's an effort by state courts to try and address the opioid crisis.
Okay. Now, you also have had grants that have supported your research, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm just looking at a few of these. Have you worked on something related to risk management and compensation in the era of naloxone that was funded by the National Institutes of Health?
Yes.
Have you worked with the impact of the New Jersey state opioid prescribing law there in New Jersey?
Yes, that's an active research project right now. We're studying the impact of new laws to improve prescribing practices in New Jersey.
Have you worked with utilization of the New York State Prescription Drug Monitoring Program in a program funded by the United States Food and Drug Administration?
Yes, that's an FDA-funded project to perform an intervention that we actually performed it in New York State to try and improve prescribing practices.
Did you work with something funded by Maimonides regarding the treatment of opioid-addicted chronic pain patients with buprenorphine?
Yes.
What about a pilot study for buprenorphine maintenance for opioid-addicted jail inmates? Did you work on something like that funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse?
I did.
Okay. Now, you also do something called peer reviewing. Can you tell the court what that is?
When an article is submitted to a journal for publication, the journal will find peers to review that article and give the journal advice on whether or not it should be accepted or what they see as a problem.
And do you do that for the New England Journal of Medicine?
I do.
And what about JAMA?
Yes.
What is JAMA?
Journal of the American Medical Association.
And you also do it for the JAMA on psychiatry and internal medicine, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What about the American Journal on Addictions
Yes.
and the Journal of Preventative Medicine?
Yes.
Okay. Now, we mentioned earlier that you've consulted around the country. Have you done work here in Oklahoma?
I have.
What about, I know you and I have talked about a lot of the work that sometimes runs together. You were telling me you believe you worked back in 2015 with the DEA here in Tulsa, or some presentations regarding it?
Yeah, I was in, I think it was 2015, I gave a talk at an event that I believe was organized by the DEA in Tulsa.
Okay. And also, have you done work with the Department of Mental Health here in the state of Oklahoma?
I have.
Do you recall what you've done on that?
Yes, I assisted in an opioid prescribing continuing medical education program with the state.
And you also were asked to speak to the Oklahoma Opioid Commission that was the bipartisan group that worked here on the opioid crisis in Oklahoma, correct?
Yes.
And I believe you're cited prominently in the final report of the Opioid Commission, correct?
Correct.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
Your Honor, we're not going to go into the commission in detail. I just want to talk about the part where Dr. Kalani's referenced. At this time, we'd offer the Oklahoma Opioid Commission report into evidence. This was a prior motion in limine by the defendants that you overruled. It states Exhibit 0210.
Counsel's correct, Your Honor, so I'll just renew the objections we made in the motion.
I'm going to overrule the objection and admit states 210 into the evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. And if we may publish at page 3.
Yes, you may.
Thank you. Mr. Medina? So if you could blow up there where it says, well, let's just go back a little bit to the top, Mr. Medina. If you'll go to the second paragraph, Dr. Kalani, you see where it says the 9-member commission chaired by Attorney General Hunter contained a variety of stakeholders. Do you see that part?
Yes.
And it discusses in the next one that over the course of 6 public meetings, members focused on the scope of the epidemic and specifically on problems Oklahoma is facing.
Yes.
And then below that it says numerous medical professionals, victims, state, and federal agencies delivered presentations and provided information. You see that?
Yes.
Now, you were one of those professionals, correct?
Yes.
And if we can blow up the part that says the epidemic, Mr. Medina, here it says Dr. Andrew Kalani, a nationally recognized expert on the opioid epidemic, spoke to the commission and explained that in 1996, the culture of prescribing opioids began to change dramatically. You with me?
Yes.
And that is something that you, in fact, talked about, right?
Yes.
And is it true that you have spent much of the last decade investigating and researching and learning about this opioid crisis and what you believe to be are the causes, the origin, and potentially the remedies for dealing with it?
That's correct.
Okay. Sir, do you believe that you have expertise, specialized skill, education, training, and knowledge regarding addiction, prescription opioids, the prescription opioid crisis, the pharmaceutical industry's marketing practices, and the role of key opinion leaders and industry-funded advocacy groups in causing this crisis, and what also we may do to solve it?
I do.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, I would like to tender Dr. Kolodny as an expert on the following issues. I'll just list them. One, defendant's multifaceted campaign to influence the medical community, policymakers, and the public about the risk and benefits of opioids. Two, the impact of defendant's campaign to increase prescription opioid prescribing. Three, actions taken by Johnson & Johnson to preserve the status quo of aggressive and excessive opioid prescribing. 4, the nature and science of opioids and prescription opioids. 5, adverse effects of opioid use, including physiological dependence, tolerance, opioid use disorder, addiction, dysfunction, immune suppression, withdrawal symptoms, and hyperalgesia. 6, the appropriate treatment of opioid use or substance use disorder and opioid addiction. 7, the lack of high-quality evidence supporting the effectiveness of long-term opioid use and the likelihood of iatrogenic addiction. And 8, certain measures that we believe will be required to abate the opioid crisis in Oklahoma and the amount of time it will take to take those steps and have them be effective. And at this time, we tender Dr. Kolodny on all these issues, which we've already dealt with in a motion in limine.
Mr. Yoder?
Yes, Your Honor. I would definitely renew the objections and issues we raised in our pretrial motion. With the court's permission, there are just a couple of points I'd like to make that really follow both from what we've heard so far from Dr. Kolodny and then the areas identified by Mr. Beck.
Why don't I have you go to the podium?
Thanks so much.
Okay.
What was it? Where's my pen? Okay. Your Honor, should we approach?
No, just, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't plan to say much, Your Honor, but the main point that I would make is that we've certainly heard that Dr. Kolodny has looked at the opioid issue, certainly has thoughts about it, has been asked to share those thoughts to various bodies. As best I could tell from what I heard, 3 times in Oklahoma, he's been asked to come and talk. But we are in a court of law, and although the descriptions of the areas in which counsel has offered Dr. Kolodny give us some guidance, as Your Honor knows from the briefing and argument on the pretrial motions, one of the real questions is whether Dr. Kolodny really has any expertise and whether he has done the type of work that would be required to present in a court of law, which is where we are now. There's different rules than testifying before a Senate or a state commission on causation, to be able to tie observations he made that may well be within his expertise to an ultimate conclusion that the cause of this crisis are items that he observed. And I think Dr. Kolodny has been very candid about things. in terms of he's not a statistician, he's done no type of statistical analysis. He relies primarily on correlation, which is not the same as causation, and it's just not his area. And so we do object to questions that would go beyond observations and opinions that really are based upon his expertise as a psychiatrist and as a public health specialist. And there's no question that he has a background in that, and I'm confident there are things he can say that would be of assistance to the court. But we do think it inappropriate to try to go beyond that and to try to take those observations into opinions on causation as to what caused some of the things that I'm sure that he'll be talking about. So on that basis, we would object to the offer because several of those items, I think, potentially invite the witness to offer that type of testimony, notwithstanding that he doesn't have the qualifications to do that, and equally important, he really hasn't done the work that a true causation expert would do in order to offer those opinions. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yoder. You want to respond to that?
Sure, I'll respond very short as I can. We did have a hearing, lasted an hour and a half. I think they were telling you to please make me stop. I talked so long on that where this exact issue was raised. I would, bring up one thing that we have developed in evidence that you didn't have to your benefit at that hearing, which was that this company, or these companies, actually took Bachelor's of Arts and Bachelor of Science majors and trained them online and in person for like 6 to 8 weeks, and then put them into doctors' offices in the state of Oklahoma and held them out to be literally pain experts. So if that's the standard for qualification for the drug company here to be able to tell doctors what they should do with opioids and also their addictive qualities, I cannot imagine that someone like Andrew Claudy wouldn't be able to talk about it. But also this idea of correlation not being causation, that's lawyer talk. The evidence in this case shows that this company actually compensated these same, quote, pain experts, end quote, based solely upon the idea of whether they could get enough prescriptions to meet their quotas. And so we're dealing with an over-prescription crisis, and that's the whole way they ran their business. So I think all this has been done already, and I would again say if this person is not qualified to talk about these issues, no one in the United States of America is. Thank you.
Mr.
Just real
Yoder.
briefly, Your Honor.
Sure.
Mr. Beckworth's argument really doesn't address the question of Dr. Kolodny's expertise and the work that he's done as to whether any opinions on causation would be reliable. The evidence is what the evidence is. And again, we're in a court of law, so we can argue as to what the evidence indicates as to sales representatives and what were said or not said about what they knew or didn't know, but that's very different than a witness coming into a court of law under oath and testifying as an expert. And our point is not that there are not things that Dr. Kolodny shouldn't be allowed to talk about. We're not saying that at all. What we're saying, though, is to take those items and then to convert them into an opinion on causation without the expertise to do that and without the work that would be done by a true expert to opine on those matters, in this court of law, it shouldn't be allowed. So that's really the nub of our objection.
Thank you. Thank you. And both gentlemen are correct. Prior to the beginning of the trial, we did have a hearing where the defendants moved to exclude Dr. Kolodny's testimony, or portions of it at least. Taking that into consideration together with the foundation that Mr. Beckworth has laid, I'm going to overrule the objection to the state's offer to tender Dr. Kolodny as an expert and find that he's qualified to render expert opinion on the 8 areas that Mr. Beckworth laid out, including abatement and any testimony regarding causation that Mr. Yoder objected to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Your Honor. May we proceed?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Yoder. Dr. Kolodny, you were here when Dr. Mazalundus testified?
Yes,
You remember you heard the drug company ask some questions about compensation?
yes,
You're being compensated for your time in preparing for and testifying in this trial, correct?
yes,
And, okay. So let's just go back through the history of you and I for a moment. Do you recall when you and I first met?
I do.
Where was it?
Kansas.
And did Mr. Pate, Mr. Duck, and Mike Burridge, all of us travel up there to see you talk?
You did.
And prior to that, you had had conversations with Mr. Whidden, correct?
I did.
And when we got done, we had dinner together, right?
We did.
And do you recall that I asked you to come work on this case?
You did.
And did I express to you that we had a pretty short time frame to get to trial and that we believed we needed your help?
You did.
Over time, did you agree to come work with us?
I did.
Okay. And what did you, I don't want to get into things that might be privileged about what you and I talked about, but is it true that I asked you to devote all of your time to helping us prepare for this day?
You were honest with me about the time commitment this would entail.
And is it true that I told you this couldn't be a hobby?
Yes, you did.
What did I ask you to do?
You asked me to devote a very large portion of the next year or so of my life to helping you with this case.
And over time, did you come to agree to do that?
I did.
And since then, have you spent any time in Oklahoma prior to this trial?
I've spent lots of time in Oklahoma.
Lots of time?
Yes.
Okay. Days and days?
Yes.
Okay. You've been here for almost every day of this trial, right?
Yes,
And when you had to go somewhere else, did you watch the trial online and read about it?
I did.
You also have traveled down to Texas
I have.
and worked with us there when we were taking a break to be with our families, those of
Yes.
us who lived in Texas, right?
Yes,
And you've been to depositions in this case, right?
I have.
You recall seeing Dr. Gilson testify?
Yes, I do.
Were you there in the room with me when he testified?
I was.
And you helped me get ready for that deposition, right?
I did.
What about Dr. Portnoy? Now, you knew Dr. Portnoy long before you ever knew me, right?
Yes.
Did you travel to New Hampshire to be in that deposition with me?
Yes.
And have you traveled to places like Albany, New York, and Chicago to be with other parts of our legal team to help attend and prepare for depositions?
I have.
Okay. Now, you also are looking at documents in this case, right?
Yes.
In fact, you have access to the database where all of J&J and the other defendants' documents have been produced, correct?
I do.
Do you spend a lot of time looking at those documents?
Yes, I do.
Let's just stop for a second about that. As you just testified, you've been doing public health investigation research on the opioid crisis going back to 2003, 2005, right?
Yes.
Have you ever had the opportunity in all those years prior to being involved in this litigation to actually see all the internal documents of Janssen and Johnson & Johnson?
No.
Could you tell the court, is it beneficial for people who do what you do to get to see the actual documents that are behind the scenes?
It's certainly beneficial to me, but I think it's also beneficial to the public. I think there's an important positive public health impact when we learn about the lies that have been told. I think that big tobacco would be a good example. The litigation against big tobacco, yes, there was settlement money, which I think has had a positive public health impact, but I think the greater impact from the litigation against big tobacco was that when the public learned about how big tobacco lied, when they learned about manipulation of nicotine levels, when they learned about targeting of adolescents, when they learned about how big tobacco lied about addiction and cancer, all of that, I believe, helped change attitudes in this country about smoking and had an enormous positive public health impact. So I believe that we can see the same benefit from the opioid litigation. I think it's happening right now. It's been happening for the past couple of weeks because the court has made this proceeding public.
And is it beneficial to folks who do the type of research and investigatory work that you're trying to do to have access to the documents that have been published already in this case?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And without access to this type of information like you've had in our case, you would never have known the extent or depth of involvement of Janssen and Johnson & Johnson other than what you had from other sources, correct?
I had been much more aware of Purdue's misdeeds and wrongdoing because a lot of that had been made public. I had a sense of Johnson & Johnson's role in the supply chain. I had seen some of their deceptive materials, but until I had an opportunity to review discovery documents you've shown me or documents I found on my own, I really was not aware of how bad Johnson & Johnson was or how big a player they've been in this whole crisis. And I think that that's probably true for many people. Purdue Pharma and the Sackers have been stealing the spotlight, but Johnson & Johnson in some ways has been even worse.
So let's go back to this idea of you working on this case. In addition to helping us, in addition to working with the Opioid Commission here in the state, you also have had a chance to lecture to leaders in the state, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, did you have an opportunity to speak for a program that Mrs. Kelly Dyer Fry did on addiction that was sponsored by the Oklahoman?
I did.
Were you a keynote speaker?
I was.
And during that time, did you have a chance to talk to and meet doctors and leaders from our community here in Oklahoma?
Yes, I did.
Now, you also have had the opportunity to speak with folks at a program sponsored by the Oklahoma State University Wellness Center, correct?
I did.
You've met Dr. Casey Schrum.
I did.
And I believe at either that one or the Oklahoman, you presented with Gary Mendel as well, correct?
At the Oklahoman with Gary, yes.
Now, Mr. Mendel is someone you know.
Yes.
And you actually are involved with something he runs called Shatterproof, correct?
Yes, I think I'm on his advisory board.
Okay. And in addition to all that, and you've also been trying to carry out your job with Brandeis and your teaching responsibilities as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, why does this all matter to you? Why are you willing to work with us, help all these investigators, research this, still teach, do your other jobs? Why are you doing it?
The opioid crisis is, I think, the most significant public health problem our country has faced, possibly in its history, certainly since the Spanish flu epidemic. The death toll is enormous, the number of individuals and families and communities that have been impacted, and I suppose that having a front seat to watching this problem get worse slowly over many years, it has made me eager to play a role in tackling the problem.
Do you feel like you've been out there on your own some on the front line of this crisis?
Early on, there were not that many of us in the medical community who were at least speaking out about what was happening.
How many times has Janssen or Johnson & Johnson reached out its hand to you to offer to help you in this work that you've been doing?
Never.
Has any of the folks that are defendants in this case, have they tried to help you and tried to say, let's work together to fix this problem?
No.
Do you feel like you've been attacked or vilified in this process?
I have been. I don't really. Yes.
Okay. You've been to my office here in Norman, our trial office, right?
Yes.
You've seen that I have something that I hang on the wall that's pretty important to me and my team?
Yes.
What is it?
It's a David and Goliath poster.
The story of David and Goliath?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I think we're sort of going beyond the facts here.
Well sustained.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Kaladi, let's turn and talk about your opinions. We're going to be here a while, and Judge Balkman has been kind enough to allow you to testify. Let's just go through at a high level some of the things we're going to talk about or you're going to talk about, and then we'll come back in detail to them. What is the difference between an opiate and an opioid? Can you tell the court about that?
I can. I think we have a slide that may be helpful.
May we publish this, sure?
As long as they've seen it first.
Pardon?
Have you seen it?
I haven't, it'd be nice to see it.
Give me 2 seconds, Mike.
Got a whole bunch of them here.
I'll get to it. Give you another copy. Your Honor, may I approach? I'll give you. Should be pretty non-controversial.
That's fine, Your Honor, thank you.
You may publish, and let's title this Court's Exhibit 46.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So you can advance the. So when we use the term opioid, that's the all-encompassing term. It includes opiates, which exist naturally inside opium sap. Opium is the sap from the poppy plant. And so inside opium, you've got codeine, morphine, thebaine, and a couple of other molecules. They're all there naturally. You can manipulate the molecules that exist naturally inside opium to create semi-synthetic opioids. And examples of semi-synthetic opioids would include heroin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, and there are others. They're all made from opium. Many people don't realize that when they take a Vicodin or a Percocet or some other prescription opioid, that they really are taking a drug made from opium. I think many prescribers may not recognize that either. Then you have a class of opioids that you don't need opium to make. They are completely synthetic. You make them out of chemicals. And that would include fentanyl, methadone, tramadol, tapentadol is another synthetic opioid. What's interesting about Johnson & Johnson is that they had all three types of opioids. They were producing, processing in Tasmania the natural opium, so they had codeine and morphine. And as we've heard, they produced a poppy rich in thebaine, which is a really good molecule for making some of the semi-synthetics. And so they had the semi-synthetics and were selling the semi-synthetics to other drug companies. And they had obviously fentanyl, tramadol, and tapentadol, which are completely synthetic. So they had a unique position in the opioid industry in that they had all three types. So, and with regard to some of the semi-synthetic, it was other drug companies selling their semi-synthetic opioids while they had some of their natural and certainly were selling their completely synthetic opioids.
May I approach the board real quick, Your Honor?
Yes.
So we're going to talk in detail about this in a moment, just to make sure we have this straight, and then I want to ask a few questions about synthetic. So on the opiate side, when Johnson & Johnson owned Tasmanian Alkaloids, they were literally growing what became thebaine, right?
They were growing poppies where the sap of that poppy plant was especially rich in thebaine. They had genetically modified the poppy plant so that they had thebaine. It was,
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. We'll get to the details of that in a moment. I just want to walk through this real quick. On semi-synthetic opioids, we see oxycodone, hydrocodone, hydromorphone. At Abatement, which Johnson & Johnson owned until 2016 or so, they were making the APIs for these, right?
That's correct.
And then when we get over here to the synthetic opioids, fentanyl is one of the drugs they sold. That was Duragesic, right?
Correct.
And they still sell it.
Correct.
As you were here yesterday when we saw on their website, they still have it on their
It's
website.
it's on their website.
And then tramadol, what's the name brand of that?
Ultram.
Or Ultracet as well?
Yes.
And you still see that on the website, right?
Yes.
And then tapentadol is not listed here, but
Yes.
that's a synthetic opioid?
Yeah, tapentadol should have been on the list. Yeah.
Okay. So does it matter to your testimony with the court of a difference between a semi-synthetic and a synthetic opioid Is there a big difference in those?
There's some differences in the pharmacokinetics of these opioids in terms of how long they may last, for example. But the reason we call them all opioids is they all produce an effect at the brain's opiate receptor, and that effect is really the same for all of the opioids listed. They all produce an opioid effect. Some on this list, for example, codeine and tramadol are weak opioids. What that would mean is you would need to take more of them to produce that mu effect. Some are extremely potent, like fentanyl, which is 75 times or more stronger than morphine. But they all produce opioid effects, and in fact, the effects produced by oxycodone and hydromorphone and some of these other opioids are really indistinguishable from the effects produced by heroin. A study was performed with experienced heroin users where they were given an opportunity to self-administer heroin. This was at Columbia University, where they have a license to do research with heroin, and some of the commonly prescribed opioids. And they didn't tell the heroin users which was which, but they let them try the different opioids and then asked them, which did you like the best? And in that study, it wasn't statistically significant because the effects were really identical for all of them. But the opioid that beat out heroin was actually oxycodone. In that study, the heroin users liked the effect of oxycodone better than heroin.
No.
Mr. Beckwith, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute break. It's now right about 10 o'clock. We'll start promptly at 10:15.
Here, I'm asking a question too. Are we going to be back to the traditional, will we go to 5 today, or do you play it by ear?
Yeah, we can go to 5 or a little bit after if we need to. It's fine with me.
I love after if you do. Thank you.
Sure.
Dr. Klodny, before we broke, you were going over this opioid map, and you see on the far right where we have synthetic opioids, fentanyl, tramadol, one, the tapentadol is not listed.
Yeah.
How does synthetic opioids show up on screening?
So synthetic opioids do not show up on routine testing, and that would include testing performed in hospital emergency rooms. Even up until recently, many medical examiners would not test for fentanyl unless they had a reason to be looking for it. So you have to do generally a send-out test or a special test to find synthetic opioids, and that's true for tramadol, tapentadol, and fentanyl. With opiates and the semi-synthetic opioids, most of the routine testing will pick them up.
So we've heard a lot of testimony about DAWN data. You just mentioned emergency room.
That's correct.
So traditionally, would it be hard to pick up fentanyl on a emergency room analysis?
Yes, and so in fact, SAMHSA, which administered DAWN, made very clear, they put in writing that when it comes to fentanyl, that DAWN estimates, that DAWN is underestimating because hospitals do not routinely test for fentanyl.
Okay. Now, we'll come back to DAWN here a little bit in the next day or so. Where would tapentadol, just to make sure that falls under tramadol,
Yeah,
right?
it should have been on the list.
Okay. All right. Now, let's go back to some of the big picture concepts. The court has heard a lot about addiction. We've had Dr. Rojas talk about that. And we've heard dependence and tolerance. Can you explain to the court the difference between those three? We can break it down or just get started.
It's really important for the court to understand the distinction between physical dependence and addiction and psychological dependence. And these terms come up. You'll see them in the continuing medical education programs that are sponsored by opioid manufacturers. You'll see the term. You'll usually see it broken down: physical dependence, tolerance, addiction, pseudo-addiction, and the educational content will generally emphasize the distinction between what's termed physical dependence and addiction. And the content will usually describe physical dependence as totally benign, something that's going to happen to everybody who takes opioids. It means don't stop the drug abruptly, but that it's clinically unimportant. Whereas addiction, or sometimes it's referred to as psychological dependence, is described in these materials that are designed to promote more prescribing. Addiction is described as rare and something that is serious but is unlikely to happen in patients who are prescribed opioids. And the reality is that we don't have a bright line between so-called physical dependence and addiction. In fact, physical dependence is not even the appropriate term, because when somebody's going into withdrawal, the symptoms are not just physical, they're not just flu-like. One of the more distressing symptoms when people are going into withdrawal is anxiety, severe anxiety. It feels like a panic attack. If you've ever wondered why people do such desperate things to maintain their opioid supply once they've become physiologically dependent, it's not that they're afraid to feel like they have the flu. It's because when you're taking opioids around the clock, one of the things that they do is they suppress a region of the brain called the locus coeruleus. That region of the brain is responsible for our fight or flight response. So if you were in the jungle and there was a lion there ready to tear you to pieces, the locus coeruleus starts firing so that you get your adrenaline, you can run for your life. When you take an opioid, it inhibits, it quiets the locus coeruleus, which is one of the reasons why people feel relaxed when they take an opioid. You're taking opioids around the clock and you're suppressing the locus coeruleus. When you stop taking opioids, the locus coeruleus wakes up with a vengeance. And people start to feel like they're going to die. They feel panicked. It's been described as a sense of impending doom. So physical dependence is not even the right term because there are psychological symptoms. The correct term is physiological dependence. But we still don't have a bright line between physiological dependence and addiction. They're very closely related, so that anybody who takes an opioid for just a few days starts to become physiologically dependent if they're doing it every day. And we wouldn't necessarily call that addiction. But if you've been taking an opioid for weeks or months or years, there's a very significant physiological dependence begins to set in. And when that patient, let's say a perfect pain patient, who always took her opioids exactly as prescribed, she's been on them for a while and now she wants to come off. When she tries to come off, she's going to have withdrawal symptoms, but even after you get the patient over the acute withdrawal symptoms, which can last a few days, that patient is going to have up to 6 months of leg kicks in the middle of the night, insomnia, fatigue, depression, and because that patient knows in the back of her mind all she'd have to do to feel better again would be to take one pill, she starts to have cravings. And so the physiological dependence and addiction are closely related, and the reason that opioids are so highly addictive is because of the physiological dependence, the fact that you feel so awful when you try and stop. That's one of the main reasons people keep using. The reason that opioid manufacturers in their educational materials for prescribers, the reason that they emphasize the distinction is because doctors are very worried about addiction. And so the way in which they were able to convince doctors that opioids are not really addictive was to rely on sort of this half-truth that physiological dependence and addiction are not the same thing. And so that was, so what they told doctors is, you've been making this mistake of thinking about addiction as this physical dependence, and you were all wrong about it. They're totally different. The physical dependence you don't have to worry about. Addiction is rare.
Okay, thank you, doctor. So we've talked about the opioid crisis, and one of the categories we've asked you to testify about is the opioid crisis. It's a big question. Can you give us the shortest answer you can? What is the opioid crisis to you?
Yeah, so we do talk about the opioid crisis, and I think it is good to sort of frame what the opioid crisis is, because you will often hear the opioid crisis framed in a way that's not helpful, particularly by front groups and key opinion leaders working for opioid manufacturers will typically describe the opioid crisis as a drug abuse crisis, which is really the wrong way to think about this. We're not dealing with an epidemic of people taking dangerous drugs because it feels good and they're accidentally killing themselves. That isn't what's really going on. The reason that Oklahoma and the United States are experiencing record high levels of overdose deaths, the reason we're experiencing record high levels of neonatal abstinence syndrome, a soaring increase in children entering the foster care system because of their parents' addiction, impact on the workforce. The reason we're experiencing all of these different health and social problems that we refer to as the opioid crisis is because of a very sharp increase in the prevalence of opioid addiction nationally from 1997 to 2011. A 900% increase in people seeking treatment for addiction to prescription opioids. So it is true that some people became opioid addicted because they had abused or took prescription opioids because they liked the effect. Other people became opioid addicted, taking opioids exactly as prescribed by doctors, but regardless of how you became opioid addicted, whether it was through medical use or non-medical use, once you are opioid addicted, what drives continued use more than anything else is not that, oh, this feels good. It's that without the drug, you're feeling very sick.
It's hard to stop.
That's right. So the correct way to frame our opioid crisis is as an epidemic of opioid addiction.
And that epidemic of opioid addiction, is it caused by an oversupply of prescription drugs?
That's correct. The reason that we are experiencing an epidemic of opioid addiction is because we've overexposed the population to this highly addictive drug.
If we just eliminated prescription opioids today and threw all of them out of the state and there were none left, what happens to people?
Well, people, so if
People who are addicted.
people who are addicted, and of course we wouldn't want to eliminate, we can't eliminate opioids, we need opioids. They are essential medicines for treating pain at the end of life and certainly when used for acute pain, so we wouldn't want to get rid of them altogether. For people who are opioid addicted, if they lose access to opioids, some might actually recover. Others, some might seek addiction treatment if they can't continue to access opioids. Others will turn to the black market and use that way. So we really have to treat people who are opioid addicted.
Is treatment the key or a key?
Yes, treatment is essential.
Okay. Now, this is also one of these bigger questions, but just kind of keep it in a summary form if you can. Why did this opioid crisis happen? Why did we end up with this oversupply of prescription drugs?
So beginning in the mid-90s, the medical community became much more aggressive in its prescribing of opioids, and we began prescribing opioids for conditions where we previously would not have prescribed opioids, or more aggressively for conditions where we might have prescribed opioids. And as the prescribing practices changed, as the culture of prescribing opioids in the United States changed, as we saw an end to this narcotic conservatism which had protected us for decades, as that prescribing took off, it led to this epidemic.
Okay. And we've heard a lot about this, I guess I would call it a debate between influence and education. You heard a lot of that dialogue between myself and Jansen, right?
Yes.
Can you tell the court what some of these messages are or were that you believe led us to the problem we have today?
Yeah, so if you could go back in time to the early 90s, that was a time when the medical community understood we had to be careful. And in fact, if you did focus groups, and opioid makers did focus groups to inform marketing strategies, if you did focus groups with doctors in the early 90s and you asked them, doctor, would you prescribe opioids for everyday pain, low back pain, or chronic headache, or fibromyalgia? If you asked doctors in the early 90s, the doctors would say no. And if you ask them, well, why wouldn't you put your chronic back pain patient on long-term opioids, the doctors would say, well, I'd be worried that if I gave lots of my patients a highly addictive drug and prescribed it long-term, lots of my patients might get addicted. I'd be worried about the physiological dependence that would set in, so that even if the patient didn't clearly become addicted, it might be very hard to ever get them off of the opioid. I would be worried about the tolerance to the pain relieving effect, so that in order for the patient to continue to get pain relief, they would need higher and higher doses. And as the doses went up, the patient's level of functioning would decline and it would become more dangerous. So no, I wouldn't use opioids for these common chronic conditions. What opioid makers did, what Johnson & Johnson did, was to reframe very good reasons for being cautious with opioids, reframe them as barriers to compassionate pain care. And in tens of thousands of continuing medical education programs across the country, the medical community starts to hear that patients have been suffering needlessly because of an overblown fear of addiction. We start to hear that we're suffering from opiophobia, an irrational fear of opioids. We start hearing, don't worry about the physical or physiological dependence. Patients can come off easily. We start hearing that these drugs are the way to improve the quality of life in your patients who might suffer with chronic pain. And of course, as we responded to this brilliant, multifaceted campaign and the prescribing took off, it led to an epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths.
Okay. Now, you were here when we went over sales call notes,
Yes.
and you've also heard some testimony so far about the use of key opinion leaders and these third-party advocacy groups, right?
Yes.
What role do you believe they played?
They played a very important role. If it had just been the attractive sales reps who visited us in our office and tried to encourage us to prescribe their company's specific products, and if it had just been the sales reps telling us, don't worry about getting your patients addicted, doctors would have been less gullible if it was just the sales reps. But it wasn't just the sales reps. We were hearing it from pain specialists, eminent in the field of pain medicine. We were hearing it from our professional societies. We were hearing it from hospitals, from state medical boards. From every direction, we were hearing that if you are an enlightened doctor in the know, you're going to be different from those stingy, puritanical doctors of the past who've been allowing patients to suffer needlessly. You'll understand that opioids are a gift from Mother Nature and should be used much more for just about any complaint of pain.
Was this message pervasive?
This message, yes, pervasive is almost an understatement. It was everywhere. It was in these continuing medical education programs. It was in textbooks. It was in journal articles. It was so pervasive that many of the doctors who were teaching this were not even getting paid by opioid manufacturers. I had attendings teaching this to me when I was in training who I don't believe were working for opioid makers, but who had heard these messages, absorbed them. This became the conventional wisdom.
Okay. Now, one of the things we've talked about and we've heard testimony about is the doctor's role with addiction. Do you believe that a doctor can prevent opioid addiction through careful selection and close monitoring?
No, we can't. There is no way to predict in advance who may or may not become addicted to opioids when they're taking them long term. And there are no strategies that will prevent a patient from becoming opioid addicted. In much of the continuing medical education programs to this day, the education for the prescriber is that you should carefully select your patient using something like the so-called opioid risk tool that's supposed to tell you what your patient's chance of getting addicted is. It's a little survey they fill out, and where there are questions, do you have a personal or family history of addiction? Do you smoke? And based on the survey that you hand the patient, you're supposed to categorize that patient as being low risk for addiction, moderate risk for addiction, or high risk for addiction. And then based on that risk stratification, you would monitor them more closely if they're higher risk. And all of this is taught as if it's a way that opioid prescribing can be safe and effective for patients. But none of it works. To begin with, that risk assessment tool that everyone's encouraged to use has been proven not to work. There is no screening instrument you can give to someone that will tell you in advance whether or not they're going to become addicted. And even if you treated everybody like the high-risk patient, where you very closely monitor them, that doesn't work either, because, so what are the close monitoring strategies? Doctors are taught to check the urine at every visit and to check this prescription drug monitoring program, or to sometimes even count the pills when the patient comes in for a visit. The idea being that if you very closely monitor your patient and there starts to be a problem, well, then you stop the opioid. But it doesn't work. If you're doing the close monitoring, let's say 3 months into this, you're checking the PDMP, and you see that your patient is visiting multiple doctors to get opioids. It's too late. The horse is out of the barn. The patient is, the doctor can get themselves out of the situation. The doctor can say to the patient, look, I can't give you opioids anymore, but the patient is left holding the bag. And even urine screening, if the patient were to start snorting the pills or injecting the pills, taking extra doses, if you check the urine, you're going to see the drug in the urine because they're taking the drug. It doesn't tell you anything. If they weren't taking their pills at all and selling them, and you check the urine, you'll see that the urine is negative for the drug. That's a sign that the patient's probably diverting. But there's no way of monitoring a patient so that you can find addiction as it's developing and then stop the treatment before it's too late. So even those close monitoring strategies don't work.
Okay. Now, we've talked in my efforts to have you qualified as an expert, we talked about one of the big picture areas was abatement. You understand that Commissioner White, who's here, and Jessica Hawkins and others will talk about the specifics of the Oklahoma abatement plan. But can you give the court your view, just generally at this time, on what the hallmarks of an abatement effort need to be?
Yes, can I just clarify something I just
Yes.
said about close monitoring strategies? They don't work for preventing addiction. I'm not suggesting that doctors shouldn't do them because for patients who are on opioids, they're certainly prudent. So you would not want a doctor to prescribe opioids to patients around the clock and not check the PDMP, not check urine. All of these are prudent and recommended. What we shouldn't do, though, is teach doctors that these are strategies that can prevent a patient from becoming addicted because they've never been proven to do that. So bringing our opioid crisis to an end, what do we do? What are the big picture strategies for bringing the epidemic to an end? We have to really prevent more people from becoming addicted and treat the people who are addicted. If you think about the strategy for how you might respond to a disease outbreak, let's just say there was an Ebola outbreak here in Norman, and we needed to do something about Ebola in Norman. And if you thought about it for a few minutes, what we would do, you'd probably realize that there were two things that have to be accomplished. You would say, well, if there's an Ebola outbreak, we need to contain the problem to prevent new cases of the infection. And we need to see that people who have the infection are receiving life-saving treatment so that it doesn't kill them. That's what we would do for an Ebola outbreak. And for our opioid addiction epidemic, it's basically the same big picture strategies. We have to contain it by preventing more people from becoming opioid addicted. And we have to see that the people who are opioid addicted are receiving effective treatment so that the disease doesn't kill them. And let me just say, though, I know I'm not going to go into great length, but I do want to just say that when it comes to preventing opioid addiction, there are different strategies, but I think the most important are strategies that will promote much more cautious prescribing so that clinicians don't directly addict their patients, and so that we don't indirectly cause addiction by stocking medicine chests with a highly addictive drug.
Do you think this is going to be easy to abate?
I think that the big picture strategies are clear, but no, we're going to be struggling with this problem for decades. If you use just as an example the heroin epidemic of the 1970s, which is an epidemic that hit New York City very hard and other cities around the country. We're about 50 years out from that epidemic, and the urban areas that got hit very hard with heroin in the 70s are still feeling the effects. And in fact, when you look at the surge in deaths we've seen in recent years involving illicitly synthesized fentanyl, the geographic areas that have been hit the hardest by illicit fentanyl are inner city communities. Washington, D.C., which was hit very hard with heroin in the 1970s, has had the highest increase in opioid overdose deaths over the past few years. So 50 years out, those communities are still feeling the effect of the heroin epidemic of the 1970s. When you look at our current epidemic, which is affecting counties and states across the country on the scale far greater than what we experienced in the 1970s. I think that all of us, everyone in this room, will be experiencing the effects of this epidemic for the rest of our lives. So no, this is not going to be easy to abate.
Well, if we need to do all these things, why wasn't this stuff being done in 1997?
Well, in 1997, I can understand why we weren't, 1997 was hard to pick up that we had a problem. By 2001, by 1999 even, there were reports coming out of Appalachia and out of New England about overdoses and addiction involving OxyContin, and that problem would continue to get worse. What happened, though, is that we saw a very effective public relations strategy, which Purdue Pharma, I think, was very good at framing, and ultimately other front groups and key opinion leaders with relationships to Johnson & Johnson would do the same. But what we started to hear was that all of this bad stuff with OxyContin, that's those drug abusers, those criminals, those junkies. And yes, that's a problem, but let's not forget about the pain patients. Millions of people are suffering with chronic pain, and they need access to these opioids. And for policymakers and for the public, the message was, we wouldn't want any kind of reduction in prescribing because you'd be punishing the pain patients for the bad behavior of those drug abusers. The issue was framed as if all of the harms were limited to so-called abusers and that opioids were helping pain patients. And of course that was completely false. If anything, people suffering with pain were disproportionately harmed. Millions of people with pain have become opioid addicted because of the increase in prescribing, and thousands of people with pain have lost their lives to opioids after they became addicted and overdosed. So it was never true that we had these two distinct groups, but that messaging was very effective. I think we've seen in some of the discovery, it was described as the anti-opioid story, the idea that you blame all of the problems on drug abusers. We know that Purdue Pharma worked with Des & Hall, a public relations firm, to get stories out in the media. When journalists started to write about the opioid crisis, they were attacked by a group called Stats that was working very closely with Purdue Pharma through Des & Hall. We started to see articles appearing that were blaming all of the problems on people who were addicted.
Well, let's talk about that, because you mentioned some things that Purdue did, and you know that Purdue and Johnson & Johnson were together in the Pain Care Forum, right?
Yes.
Now, you've been here in court, like we saw examples of the McKinsey documents that I went over with Ms. Deem Eshelman. Do you recall seeing efforts at Johnson & Johnson to capitalize on what was being called the Oxy issue?
Yes. So from the documents I've looked at, it appears that Johnson & Johnson saw a marketing opportunity in the bad press that Purdue Pharma was getting on OxyContin. They were concerned this could hurt their sales to some extent because of bad press about opioids as a class of drug, but they also saw, I believe, as an opportunity that they could tell doctors, well, this isn't OxyContin, that's where there's a problem, this is somehow safer.
And did we see that in the sales notes with doctors right here in Oklahoma that have been gone over in court?
Yes, we saw that over and over again, that a prescriber who would be concerned about addiction would be told by a sales rep that Duragesic, the fentanyl patch, a highly addictive drug, has a low abuse potential. Call notes that said, showed dawn. told doctor low abuse potential with Duragesic.
So you've also been here when we see the unbranded efforts that J&J and Janssen had in 07 and 08 as they were getting ready to launch Tapentadol. In your opinion, was Johnson & Johnson just trying to keep the status quo, or were they ramping up the idea that pain is still so undertreated that we need to have more opioids in the market?
I'm sorry, you're talking about which time frame?
2007, 2008?
So after Len Palazzi's paper came out, it was perfectly clear to everyone that the increase in prescribing was fueling a public health problem. And despite the fact that we knew then what needed to happen, we needed more cautious prescribing, Johnson & Johnson was doing everything it possibly could to get doctors to prescribe more opioids.
In Oklahoma?
In Oklahoma and across the country.
Now, you talked just a moment ago, I want to go back to something. You were giving an example about the idea of monitoring addiction, and you came back and said there are some things that, while they may not be great, doctors should still be careful and monitor those. You remember that testimony?
Yes.
Okay. Should doctors be taught that when someone presents with something that might be addiction, that it's just fake addiction?
No, pseudo-addiction is an exceptionally dangerous concept. So the message for a prescriber should be that if you think there's any chance at all that your patient might be addicted, doctor, you need to stop, take a deep breath, talk with that patient's family members, because the patient may not want to tell you that they're addicted. The patient may either be ashamed or is afraid you won't write the prescription and doesn't want to go into withdrawal. So talk to family members, get as much collateral information as you possibly can. Very carefully evaluate this patient or send them for an evaluation to determine whether or not they have this life-threatening disease of addiction. The concept of pseudo-addiction was really to tell prescribers to do the exact opposite. Doctor, if you think your patient might be addicted because they're asking for higher and higher doses or they're coming in early, you should give them more opioids. The problem, doctor, isn't the patient, it's you. You're not giving them enough opioids. You're under-treating their pain. And it kind of works in the short run. Sure enough, if you give somebody who's opioid addicted as much opioids as they could possibly want, yes, they stop coming in early. They may spend their life narcotized on a sofa, but more likely, even they may experience an overdose, even a fatal overdose. Giving someone who's opioid addicted more opioids is a very dangerous thing to do.
Now, you talked about earlier that you wrote a paper on evidence-based prescribing, right?
This was a joint effort, myself and other docs from different specialties put together an educational brochure called Cautious and Evidence-Based Opioid Prescribing.
Can you tell the court what that is? What is evidence-based prescribing?
You know, the movement toward evidence-based prescribing or evidence-based practice, I think that began maybe in the late 90s. The idea was that many medical practices are not necessarily based on evidence. Many doctors will practice in a particular way because they learned to practice that way from an attending physician when they were a resident. A lot of what we were doing, we began to recognize, was not based on good evidence. And so it was almost a movement within medicine, a very positive movement, to try and base our clinical decision-making on the best available evidence, particularly when a treatment posed serious risks to a patient. The clinician should really be able to weigh risk versus benefit.
I'm going to turn your attention to a document that's in evidence already. It states Exhibit 2538. We can turn to page 31. So, Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes, you may.
So you just talked about evidence-based prescribing as a move that happened in the late 1990s, right?
Yes.
Now, you've heard us talk in this case about SWOT. It's a marketing concept of strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right?
Yes.
Okay, so here, this is a Janssen pain franchise SWOT analysis. Under the threats, do you see something that talks about evidence-based prescribing? Mike, can you highlight?
Yes, I do.
What does it say?
It says move towards evidence-based prescribing. That's categorized as a threat.
And that's a threat in Janssen's documents about its pain franchise.
Yeah, it would appear that Johnson & Johnson saw this movement toward evidence-based prescribing practices as something that would be bad for their business.
Now let's look at the weaknesses. So if we look at weaknesses, if you could blow that up, and can you highlight the fourth bullet point, Mr. Medina? What do we see there, Dr. Plotkin?
Limited clinical data.
Limited clinical data.
Yes.
What is clinical data?
Clinical data would be evidence, for example, from adequate and well-controlled studies. And so what I believe they're referring to as a weakness is the fact that adequate and well-controlled studies demonstrating that opioids improve function or that they're safe and effective for long-term use, that those adequate and well-controlled trials had not been performed. So they had limited clinical data. They recognized that as a weakness.
But what about high-quality clinical data on iatrogenic addiction?
I don't believe, certainly at that point, or to this day, I don't believe a really good study has ever been performed that could answer the question about what percentage of patients will become addicted through long-term medical use. The way you would really answer that question would be to perform what we call a prospective study, where you would take, say, 100 people with chronic pain who had never taken an opioid before, and you would put all 100 of them on an opioid for round the clock for 90 days, and at the end of the 90 days you try to take away the opioid and carefully assess everyone to see who did or did not become addicted. That would answer the question. Probably not ethical to perform a study like that. I don't know that a study like that has ever been performed, but that would answer the question. Because we don't have prospective studies, the best estimates come from looking at patients who are already on opioids and assessing those patients for addiction and looking at the prevalence rate of addiction or opioid use disorder in patients who are on long-term opioids. And those studies show us a very high rate, a very high prevalence of opioid use disorder in patients on long-term opioids for chronic pain.
So to say that if you take prescription opioids under a doctor's care for a long period of time, you have a low chance of becoming addicted. Does Janssen or Johnson & Johnson, have they performed the high-quality clinical studies to back that statement up?
No, that statement is not supported by evidence.
And were you here when I asked Johnson & Johnson and Janssen that very question, what the rate of addiction is, even as we sit here today?
Yes.
And what did they say?
They said they don't know.
So let's turn our attention and talk about where we are in Oklahoma. You've gone through kind of the big high-level concepts that we'll be covering in your testimony. Here in Oklahoma, we've discussed issues about how you spoke at the Opioid Commission and other things. Have you had a chance to work with Jason Beeman?
I have.
He's a doctor here in Oklahoma.
Yes, he is.
Works with Oklahoma State University.
Yes.
You've worked with him on issues related to opioid addiction and the crisis we have here in Oklahoma, correct?
Yes, I have.
You've also had a chance to meet and get to know Commissioner White and work with her.
Yes.
And have you had a chance to meet and get to know Jessica Hawkins?
I have.
And you've worked with the state, as we showed in the Opioid Commission and other areas, for quite some time now.
Yes, and other doctors on projects with the state.
Okay. Now, you also as we talk about your work and your investigatory work, you've had an opportunity to talk to doctors from various parts of the country, right?
Yes, I have.
Are opioids different in New York than they are in Oklahoma?
No, the molecule is the molecule.
Is addiction different for a patient in New York than in Oklahoma?
Opioid use disorder, the disease is the same. It may sometimes look different in different in people with different lifestyles, but the disease is the disease.
Now, you've spent quite a bit of time looking at the national marketing strategies of Janssen and Johnson & Johnson, right?
I have.
Did they have a strategy that applied everywhere but Oklahoma?
No, their Oklahoma strategy was was the same as their national strategy.
Right. We've seen examples of things they did here in Oklahoma that were part of their bigger picture national strategy, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you believe, in your experience and work here in the state, that Oklahoma has been hit hard by this opioid crisis?
Yeah, Oklahoma is one of the hardest hit states in the country in terms of overdose deaths, the rate of overdose death, and in opioid prescribing. And certain types of opioid prescribing, Oklahoma is at the very top of the list.
Okay. Your Honor, I'm going to approach, if I may, with Court's Exhibit 1.
Yes, you may.
Thank you.
It's upside down.
Well, it certainly is today.
Just making sure I'm paying attention.
Okay, there we go. Now, you know Dr. Courtwright, right?
I do.
How do you know him?
We wrote a paper together.
You were here when he testified.
Yes, I was.
Now, you've asked me to go over this with you. Why is this depiction of a dam of narcotic conservatism, why is that important to you?
The first time I saw this graphic was during Dr. Courtwright's testimony, and it does make a lot of sense to me based on my understanding of our nation's history with opioid addiction. And so, as Dr. Courtwright very nicely testified to, we had an opioid addiction epidemic in the past, very similar to the one we're dealing with today, particularly in the latter half of the 19th century. And as Dr. Courtwright testified, that epidemic came to an end because of what was termed narcotic conservatism. That as the medical community learned that we need to be very cautious with this dangerous class of drug, as we learned to be careful, narcotic conservatism really kept the public safe.
In 1995, based on the work that you've done and you've heard Claire Wynn testify, did Oklahoma have an opioid crisis?
In 1995, I would refer to it as, it looks like a dam. I would say that the dam of narcotic conservatism in 1995 was still intact.
Now, Your Honor, may I approach with blow up from State's Exhibit 0906?
Yes, you may.
Now, you've seen this. I think it was gone over yesterday with Rizai Stone. You're familiar with this graph?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and if we look here in 94, 95, this is oxycodone consumption in milligrams per capita in the United States. It's pretty low, right?
That's correct, and although this graphic is oxycodone, my understanding is that morphine consumption, even fentanyl consumption, hydrocodone consumption were all much lower before 1996.
And would you say that at 95, 96, that dam of narcotic conservatism was still erect?
1996, it begins to break down. So 1996 is the inflection point, not just on this graph for oxycodone, but for hydrocodone, morphine. All opioids in the United States that were on the market before 1996, 1996 is the year that the prescribing begins to really take off.
And you see that consumption skyrockets, right?
That's correct.
Now this red line depicts Europe. You see that?
Yes.
Now, You've been to college, you're a medical doctor, right?
Yes,
You know we fought World War I and World War II.
that's correct.
And America was a big part of those two campaigns, right?
Yes, it was.
And grandfathers, uncles, some aunts, grandmas, they were there in Europe.
They were.
correct? We came back and from the 40s, 1914, the 40s, all the way to 95, we seem to be on the same track of consumption with Europe, right?
Yes.
So what in the world happened to cause this diversion from 1996 between the United States consumption and Europe?
We destroyed the dam of narcotic conservatism and we flooded the country with opioids.
I know you've been to Tasmania, but didn't you also go to Sweden?
Uh,
World Health Organization?
Switzerland.
Switzerland. Have you been to Europe, other places?
Yes,
Have you looked at this issue in Europe?
I have.
Are Europeans tougher than Americans?
I don't think so.
Did something happen in America where all of a sudden the amount of people suffering from pain went through the roof?
No.
Where was the event, doctor, where all of a sudden Americans could no longer cope without opioids? Where was it?
I don't think it happened.
Well, something happened. Look at Europe. Are they calmer and don't have the problems that we have with pain and osteoarthritis and neuropathy and lower back pain? Are Europeans just healthier than us and tougher than us?
I don't think so. In fact, despite all of our opioid prescribing in the U.S., this massive consumption, no other country on earth comes close to our level of opioid consumption. Despite that, there is zero evidence that we do a better job of treating chronic pain in the United States than in any of these other countries, despite this public health price that we're paying for all of these opioids. Zero evidence that we're doing better at treating pain.
Okay, so we're going to keep that over there, and we're going to come back to this in just a moment.
Your Honor, may I approach this for a second?
Yes, you may. No problem. Let's take how about a 5-minute break? Okay. Yeah. We're going to take just a brief 5-minute break. proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. So, Dr. Kolodny, you were just talking about how on the timeline of oxycodone consumption that the dam had broken. Let's talk a little bit about this time period and where these drugs came from. You've said already the names of other drug companies, including Purdue, right?
Yes,
And you've talked about the pharmaceutical industry with respect to opioids, right?
yes.
Now, one of the things that we've talked about and you've heard a lot in this case is the concept of unbranded marketing.
That's correct.
Have you seen in the documents and in the testimony thus far references to opioids generally by Johnson & Johnson?
Yes, and before this trial, I was familiar with their non-branded marketing.
And the idea being that they market not a name brand drug like Duragesic or Ultram, but just opioids broadly as a class, right?
That's correct. Opioids as a class, and the material wouldn't mention the name of a specific product.
Okay, thank you. Now, when you were going over the idea of all these synthetic opioids that were made earlier, and I asked you some questions about where Thebane came from, and then who turned it into oxycodone, and then the defendant's name brand drugs. Do you recall that?
I do.
Okay. So you talked about Tasmanian alkaloids and Aramco. We've talked about that a little bit before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to give you guys a copy of something. Give me that. Give me that. Okay. So, we're gonna use this. Your Honor, at this time we have a couple of court exhibits or demonstratives we'd like to go over. I've just given the defendant's copies, and I've taken something off of one of the paper copies for what we'll publish here.
Any objection to those? Still working on it?
Assuming what I was told is accurate, which I have no reason to believe it's not, I do not have an objection to showing.
All right.
I understand they're not being offered as exhibits. I assume we'll mark them as a court exhibit of some kind.
Are there two, Mr. Beckler?
Yes, sir.
All right, I think we're up to exhibits 47 and 48. You want to identify those?
Yes, sir. If I may approach.
Yes. I can just write it on there.
This is 47. This is 10. May we publish those, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Okay, Mr. Medina, would you please put up Court's Exhibit 47? Now, Dr. Kolodny, you've seen, and we'll go over here in a minute, you saw a slide during earlier testimony about a medal that was given to Mr. Fish. Do you recall that?
I do.
And it talked about the enabling the growth of oxycodone.
Yes.
So let's look at this. You're familiar with the way that Tasmanian alkaloids and Aramco were tied to Johnson & Johnson, correct?
Yes.
Now, you testified that you actually went down to Tasmania. Did you go down to the fields where this stuff was grown?
Yes.
And did it look like this when you were there?
No, the poppies had just recently been harvested.
Okay.
So
but,
it was like they looked like mowed fields.
okay. But you've developed an understanding of how Thebane works and concentrated poppy straw and the like works, correct?
Yes.
Okay, we'll go into those in just a minute. If you can go to the next course, please. Now, one of the things that we're dealing with in this case is this idea of opioids broadly as a class. We just talked about that a minute ago.
Yes.
And are you aware that through Tasmanian alkaloids and Aramco, Johnson & Johnson actually provided some of these opioids, not only to itself, but to Purdue, Teva, Endo, and other manufacturers?
Oh, yes, I would say more than just some, quite a bit.
Okay, perfect. Now, we talked about excuse me, my head's down in the box there. We've talked about Mr. Fisk,
Yes,
and you know who that is, right?
yes,
Okay. Have you had a chance to read the article by Mr. Fisk related to the history of Tasmanian alkaloids?
yes.
Okay. Your Honor, this is already in evidence. If we could publish states 0006.
Yes, you may.
Now, Your Honor, may I also approach?
Yes.
Now, Dr. Plodney, would it help you to get off the stand and go over this, or are you comfortable there?
I can get up.
Is it okay with you?
Sure, that's fine. As
So-
long as we can hear you when you speak, just turn this way so we can catch you.
Okay, so you're aware that Dr. Fisk, or A.J. Fisk, I don't think he was a doctor, actually worked with Johnson & Johnson in Tasmania, right?
Yes.
And he wrote this paper that we asked Johnson & Johnson about, their witness didn't recall or know the information.
Yes.
Let's go through this real quickly. So, Mike, if you can go to introduction down here and we'll blow this up. One of the things that Mr. Fisk said in his paper was he talks about the role of science and technology in the poppy industry. And it says here that this is one scientist who has been involved in the industry since 1981, right?
Yes.
And what does it say here about the history of these drugs? If you'll go down to the next part, Mr. Medina, where it says the Tasmanian poppy industry, can you blow that one up? Is it true what he says, that this herb, the opium poppy, has been associated with problems throughout history?
Yes. Yes, it is.
And did that ever change when we had prescription drugs being made, like oxycodone and others? Did opium stop being a problem? Did the synthetic or semi-synthetic nature of these prescription drugs just make them no longer addictive or subject to any abuse?
No, we've known for centuries, we've known since the time of Hippocrates that opioids were a double-edged sword, that they could relieve pain, but that they could also produce addiction and death.
Okay. Now, that's never changed.
No.
We'll turn to page 2. Now, if we can blow up this paragraph that starts whilst, Mr. Medina. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, in this paragraph, it talks about thebaine being a minor constituent of opium poppies, right?
Yes.
But it's the main alkaloid present in a new variety of poppy developed by Tasmanian alkaloids, right?
Yes.
Did you later learn that was the Norman poppy?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about here is, it says that thebaine's not itself used in therapy, but it's an important raw material in the manufacture of several opioids, such as oxycodone. Now let's stop there. We see oxycodone on the consumption chart,
Yes.
right? Sorry.
Yes.
If you'll turn to
Yes.
Thomas Angie so she can hear. And then this is interesting. It says, in buprenorphine and NAL compounds such as naloxone and naltrexone.
Yes.
Could you tell the court the difference between taking an opioid for pain relief or abuse versus these other opioids that we see, buprenorphine and naloxone and naltrexone?
Yep. So oxycodone is obviously an opioid that's typically prescribed for pain. That would be its use. Buprenorphine, the primary use of buprenorphine is as a medication for treating opioid addiction, a disease that can develop from taking too much oxycodone. Naloxone, as you know, is used to reverse an overdose, which can be caused by taking too much oxycodone. And naltrexone is another medicine that's used for treating opioid addiction. So if you were a drug maker with all of these molecules, you would be able to profit off of a drug that's causing addiction and overdose deaths, as well as profit off of drugs that are used to treat addiction and overdose deaths.
And we'll go into this later, but this is Johnson & Johnson. I mean, they're making what goes into oxycodone, but also what goes into naloxone and naltrexone, right?
That's correct.
Now, in this next sentence, it talks about the major markets for thebane are USA, and it says that imports are not restricted under the 80-20 rule. You see that?
Yes,
Okay, you're familiar with the 80-20 rule?
I am.
Let's kind of hold off on that. We'll come back to it, okay? Now, Mr. Medina, if we go to page 3, first paragraph. You can highlight, pull up the first one. So this talks about how Johnson & Johnson came to own Tasmanian alkaloids. And if we can look here at the last full sentence, Mike. Doctor, it talks there about how the company was purchased by J&J for its codeine, right?
Yes,
Now, Johnson & Johnson historically had made Tylenol with codeine, right?
that's correct.
Okay, and it talks about that here. Johnson & Johnson are manufacturers of the Tylenol range of pain medication.
That's
Right.
correct.
So, Tylenol.
Correct.
Okay. And it says here that purchase of Tasmanian alkaloids were made to ensure a reliable source of raw materials.
That's right. That's my understanding as to why Johnson & Johnson purchased Tasmanian alkaloids. They wanted to ensure a good supply of codeine.
Okay, so perfect. Let's just stop right there. When we look at this consumption map, way back here in 1982, consumption of oxycodone in Europe and the US is very low, right?
Yes,
And damage seems to be up.
yes.
Okay, so let's go to the bottom of that page, Mr. Medina. We have a graph. Can you pull up this poppy crop area? So this article talks about some of the agricultural challenges facing growing this opium in Tasmania, right?
Yes.
And the author, speak up so she can hear you.
Yes.
The author puts a graph in here about how the area of growth, or hectares, was used there. And we see something depicted. What happens, let's just start in 1990. He's showing about 5 HA to the 1,000, right? Correct? You gotta speak up and say yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. And over time, from 1995 to 2001, what happens to the amount of acreage that is being used to grow these poppies?
So the amount of land used to cultivate poppies in Tasmania begins increasing, and it actually, is it okay if I mention what's happened since?
Sure.
Because this graph ends in 2001, but as opioid consumption in the United States kept increasing, in Tasmania they needed to find more and more land suitable for poppy cultivation. Ultimately, I believe they ran out of good land in Tasmania for cultivating poppies, and so laws were changed by the Australian government so that poppies could be now cultivated in mainland Australia, which is something that didn't happen previously. So they more or less ran out of land in Tasmania for cultivating poppies because of this flood of opioids into the United States.
So let's stay there and let's go over here. I'm going to go back to my board. So you see in the 96, 97 range, that crop area does what?
It increases.
Dramatic.
Yes, it does.
Okay, and what happens over here on the oxycodone consumption board? What happens in 1996? Does it go up or stay flat?
It goes up. In order for that to happen, this needed to happen.
So by that, you're referring to the increase in consumption of oxycodone.
Correct.
And by the second that, you meant the increase in poppy crop area.
Correct.
Okay. But it wasn't just area, it was also potency of the thebane, right?
Well, yes. So in order to supply enough oxycodone, it was to grow poppies that were rich in the desired precursor, thebane. That was also necessary.
Okay. Now, Mr. Medina, can we go to page 6, please? If you'll blow up the paragraph under example 3. So, Dr. Claudney,
Yes.
we looked at how, go down, Mike, I need it where it says until 1996, right? So we looked at how in 1982, Johnson & Johnson purchased Tasmanian alkaloids for its Tylenol with codeine, right?
Correct.
We also looked at how the acreage was more limited until we get to the 96, 97 timeframe, right?
Correct.
And we just established that both the acreage and the consumption of oxycodone went up at about the same time, right?
Correct.
Okay. So here it talks about the development of the thebaine poppy. Are you familiar with the thebaine poppy?
Yes.
So here we go again. It says here in this first sentence, until 96, Tasmania was a small producer of thebaine, which was extracted from poppies grown primarily for morphine, right?
Correct.
Now, can you explain to the judge, I know you're not, you don't grow this stuff, but do you have an understanding of what thebaine is?
Yes.
Can you explain to the judge how thebaine or concentrated poppy straw works?
So the traditional way of obtaining morphine, for example, the traditional way of obtaining morphine, you would cultivate poppies, you'd extract the sap from the poppy plant, and you'd refine that sap to obtain the morphine. So that's raw opium. What Johnson & Johnson was doing was creating a product called concentrated poppy straw, or concentrate of poppy straw. And instead of extracting the sap from the poppy plant, they would more or less mow the field at just the right point, obtain what they called poppy straw and refine it and concentrate it. And so that was concentrated poppy straw. When they began to, so they genetically modified the poppy to produce more thebaine, and when the concentrated poppy straw thebaine became the best opium to use for making oxycodone.
Okay, so let's go and explore that a little further. Mr. Medina, there you go. So right here it says, a research project was established at Tasmanian Alkaloids in 1994. You with me so far?
Yes.
And what does it say after that to finish that sentence? Getting right here.
In order to develop a high thebaine poppy variety to meet the anticipated demand. It says anticipated demand.
Okay. Now, in 1994, did something happen with respect to Oxycontin?
Yes, in 1994, Purdue Pharma was gearing up for the release of OxyContin.
Did they file something called an NDA or new drug application?
Yes, they filed their new drug application, I believe in 1994.
Okay, so bear with me. Let's go back over here to, is this 906? Okay. So exhibit 906, we got to blow up. Let's go back to 1994. How is the United States sitting in relation to Europe with oxycodone consumption?
We were a little higher.
But were we a lot higher?
No.
And had our trajectory, according to this exhibit, stayed pretty much the same?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything that would suggest that things were going to skyrocket in a few years?
Well, nothing on that graph, there would be no way to know.
But when we go to Mr. Fisk's article, who's giving a historical perspective from the standpoint of Johnson & Johnson, it says right here that in 1994, it started researching a way to develop a high thebaine poppy to meet anticipated demand, right?
That's correct.
Your Honor, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I would just object to the leading questions as opposed to trying to get the testimony from the witness.
I'll rephrase.
Thank you.
We see anticipated demand.
We do.
Okay. So let's turn, if we can, Mr. Medina, to page 7. And we'll tie all this together, Dr. Claudia, the best we can. Let's go blow up this first full paragraph, the second paragraph on the page. Okay. Can you read, turn and tell the court so the court reporter can get this?
It's hard to read it and talk to the court reporter.
Okay. Why don't you sit down? That would be easier. So what does it say about the development?
It says the development of the Norman poppy coincided with the release of a slow-release formulation of oxycodone in the USA.
Okay. Now, does this use the word the or a?
A.
And in 1995, was a slow-release formulation of oxycodone launched in the United States of America?
Yes, it was.
What was it?
OxyContin.
Okay. And here, what does it say next?
Oxycodone is used in treatment of strong pain, mostly in terminally ill patients.
Mostly in terminally ill patients, right?
That was correct at that time.
Was it true after 97?
Not after the dam of narcotic conservatism had been broken.
Okay, so what does this paragraph say next?
The new formulation was very successful, and there was greatly increased demand for the thebaine raw material used for its manufacture.
Let's hold there. I'm going to go back over our blow-up of 906. After 96, 97, what happened with consumption in the United States of America?
It takes off.
What happened with consumption in Europe?
It pretty much stayed flat. There was a gradual, very small increase in recent years, but that's about it.
Now, we just looked at the increase in crop acreage a minute ago. Do you remember that graph?
Yes.
And so what does the next sentence say happened?
The high demand has caused an increase in crop area in India, as well as allowing growth of thebaine crop in Tasmania.
Okay. Now, Mr. Medina, can we go to the bottom of the next paragraph, please? So, Dr. Kolodny, this next paragraph, it says high alkaloid, and it gives the scientific name, poppies, can be grown without risk of diversion for illicit purposes. You see that?
Yes.
Is it possible to increase the supply of prescription opioids without risk of diversion?
Well, I think what they're referring to here would be if all you have is thebaine. Thebaine is preferred because it's harder. If it got diverted, you can't really abuse thebaine. People who use thebaine will often have seizures. It's not a drug that would be used illicitly.
But is that same thing true for prescription drugs that have opium in them?
No, and as soon as you manipulate the thebaine molecule into oxycodone, you've got a drug that's almost identical to heroin.
Okay. And if we look at this next sentence, it says thebaine can be converted into codeine, which is currently the largest volume API produced from opium alkaloids. Do you see that?
Yes.
But then what does the rest of the sentence say?
So perhaps virtually all the world's opium alkaloids will eventually come from poppies having the Norman mutation.
Now, again, for the court, I don't know if we covered this term alkaloid. What is an opium alkaloid?
Alkaloid is a classification for a type of molecule.
Okay. And then if we go to the next deal here, it says, this innovation, like most of the plant breeding projects in the poppy industry, what does it say at the end of that sentence?
Had virtually no input from the public sector.
And where does it say the idea for this came from?
The idea is developed from discussions in Tasmanian Alkaloids and Johnson & Johnson Research and Johnson & Johnson Company based in Sydney.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's continue, please. Your Honor, at this time, I would like to publish Exhibit 0494, which is a 1998 letter from Naramco. It's already in evidence.
You may do so.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Kolodny, may I approach again, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Dr. Kolodny, we'll move through these. We just kind of looked at this history from Mr. Fist. Now, if we can kind of go through this letter, you were here when I asked Johnson & Johnson about this letter, and the witness said she didn't have an awareness of it. She just had to read through it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so this is an October 15, 1998 letter from Naramco to PF Laboratories. You see that?
I do.
And you're familiar, what does PF stand for?
I believe that's Purdue Frederick Laboratories. That's Purdue.
And in the first sentence, what does it say?
We are pleased to be working with PF Laboratories on the supply of oxycodone.
Now, we just went over Mr. Fist's article, and it talked about high thebaine, right?
Yes.
And here in the second paragraph, the second sentence, what does it say?
We have made significant progress since our meeting of July 29th. First, we have received the high thebaine concentrated poppy straw from Tasmanian alkaloids, completed the laboratory work, and are starting up production based on this material next week.
Okay, and let's look at the next paragraph, please, Mike. You can blow up the one that says capacity. It says, do you see where we are, Dr. Clive?
Yes,
And this talks about doing what to capacity?
expanding it.
And it talks also about a Wilmington facility will do the penultimate and final steps of oxycodone being able to produce them being completed by year end, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, Mr. Medina, if we can turn to the back of that page where it talks about thebaine. So if you can blow up this part. So we just went through the FIST article again, and we're looking at anticipated demand. You recall that?
Yes.
So again here, it says, in my letter of August 10th, in the context of a long-term agreement, Naramco will do what?
Work with PF Laboratories to secure its entire worldwide requirements.
Now, please read for the court what the next sentence says.
This is not a minor point. As we have discussed, access to raw materials is going to be critical to obtaining security of supply.
So we saw that in the FIST article too, right? The idea of anticipating demand.
Yes,
And the next step, what does it say?
we have been discussing supply of oxycodone for many years now.
Does it say 1 or 2?
It says many years.
Okay, and this is 1998.
Correct.
All right, and then if we look to the next part, what does it say about the need for a long-term commitment?
Naramco can work to provide even more capacity than in this proposal that will give PF Laboratories the maximum security of its supply for its franchise by virtue of.
Okay, and Mr. Medina, if we can go right up to where the signature is. At the bottom, what does Mr. Kindergan from Johnson & Johnson, what does he say they need from Purdue Frederick Laboratories in exchange?
We need long-term commitment from PF Laboratories to be able to provide the support this proposal envisions.
Okay, thank you. Now, at this time, if we could publish states 1788, which is in evidence.
Yes, you may.
Now, Dr. Kolodny, have you had an opportunity to look at the supply agreement between Purdue and the Naramco Johnson & Johnson entity?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and if we can look at the term of this agreement, Mr. Medina, if you can pull up 1.5, the two entities engaged in an agreement for Naramco to provide oxycodone hydrochloride, right?
Correct.
I'm just going to check. I'm not clear the purpose of this questioning, but it sounds like he's asking the witness to interpret agreement or offer legal interpretations of the agreement. I don't really think it's for this witness.
That's not our purpose at all. We're going through a factual predicate.
Objection overruled.
So if you look at this, this talks about a term from 1999 to 2003.
Yes.
Okay. So if we could just go to paragraph 6 on page 003, Mr. Medina. So we've talked a lot about thebaine and you being in Tasmania to understand how this works, right?
Correct.
So if we look at this agreement, what is being supplied? Do you see where Naramco and its affiliate will use reasonable commercial efforts to ensure PF Laboratories, current supplier in the U.S., talks about Mallinckrodt and McFarland. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And then it's providing what?
Your Honor, I'm sorry. May we approach real quick?
Yes.
Thank you.
request of Purdue, that will be maintained as confidential and will not be published. And we'll make a request that that document not be made available to the media for dissemination. You may
Thank Your Honor.
proceed.
Yes, sir. And if I may just show the witness this last question, since we're not publishing it. This is my highlighted copy, but you see on 1788, what is Naramco offering to provide with respect to Thebank?
Concentrate of poppy straw from Tasmanian alkaloids by Naramco.
And you're familiar that concentrate of poppy straw is from time to time referred to as CPS, correct?
Correct.
And Your Honor, if I may just remain, I can move through the next one without publishing it.
I'll let you do that.
Thank you. On 2373 is something that's also already in evidence, which was a letter from Michael Friedman of Purdue. And you're familiar, he used to be the CEO of
Yes.
Purdue.
Yes.
And this is just talking about supply. And you've seen this document before. Can you just read for the court the last sentence from Mr. Friedman?
Right here at the bottom.
Yes, sir.
The principal barrier to a higher sales achievement before year end is product supply.
Okay. Thank you. Now, Your Honor, one that's definitely public is 0340. This is the Naramco metal that we've talked about in the past. Could we publish that, please?
Yes, you may.
So, Mr. Medina, if you can blow up this email on the first page, you see, Dr. Kolodny, this email is from Mike Kindergan. Now, that's the same person that signed the 1998 letter to Purdue Frederick, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what does he say here in the beginning?
By way of introduction, I am the VP Worldwide Bulk Analgesics for Naramco.
Okay. Now, if you look to the last sentence before the PowerPoint is attached, it starts, I have. What does Mr. Kindergarten say to Mr. Blockinger from Janssen?
I've attached a short presentation summarizing our involvement in the pain management franchise.
Okay. And you've seen throughout this trial the words pain franchise used
I have.
with respect to Johnson & Johnson.
Yes.
Okay, so let's turn to the first page of this document. So there we see an organizational alignment, and on the top is what?
Johnson & Johnson.
And underneath it, there's Janssen on one side and Aramco on the other, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so Mr. Medina, if we can go to the next page. And here it says Naramco has 3 franchises. Do you see that?
I do.
And if we go to the bottom part, at the middle, it says opiate narcotic raw materials or APIs, right?
It does.
And you understand that that's an active pharmaceutical ingredient.
I do.
And I think we probably covered this, but just for the court's benefit, again, the Thebaine is then processed and becomes an active pharmaceutical ingredient, right?
That's right. Thebaine isn't typically used. It's used by itself. You convert it into other opioids.
Okay, and we see synthetic narcotic APIs there, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go to the next page, please, Mr. Medina. So, if we look at the next page, it lists quite a few pain management APIs,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Now, we see up there oxycodone hydrochloride. That's one, correct?
That's correct.
And that's basically what is Oxycontin, right?
Oxycodone hydrochloride is the active ingredient in OxyContin and Percocet and in Roxycodone.
Okay, what about hydrocodone?
Hydrocodone is the active ingredient in Lortab and Norco and Vicodin.
So we heard John McGregor talk about taking Lortabs. Hydrocodone is an API for Lortabs, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then we see codeine. Is codeine an opioid?
It is.
And morphine sulfate, what kind of drugs is that used in?
It's used in morphine. MS Contin is an example.
Okay, and then buprenorphine, you've talked about your experiences working on that project in New York, right?
Yes, buprenorphine is sometimes prescribed as a pain, is used as an analgesic, but it's more widely used in the United States for treating opioid addiction.
And then earlier you talked about these semi-synthetic opioids. We see fentanyl and sufentanil and oxymorphone listed, correct?
Yes, we do.
Okay, and the fentanyl, that's Duragesic, or that's an example of it, right?
Yes, so fentanyl and sufentanil would be synthetic. And by the way, as we heard from Claire Wynn in her testimony, fentanyl is 75 times stronger than morphine. Sufentanil is 10 times stronger than fentanyl, which means it's 750 times stronger than morphine. So that's an extremely dangerous product.
Okay, so if we turn to page 006, when this gentleman was explaining the importance of Noramco to Johnson & Johnson's pain management franchise, what does he say here about the importance of the poppy?
The poppy is the foundation of the opiates business.
All right, now let's turn to the next slide. We've seen this before. And I don't think we need to talk about the metal, but consistent with your work on this idea of Thebaine and CPS, what does this gentleman attribute as leading to the growth of oxycodone in America?
The Thebaine poppy, and he characterizes it as a transformational technology.
And it led to the growth of oxycodone, right?
It helped make that possible.
Well, the word they used was enable.
Objection
Yes.
leading, Your Honor.
Sustained.
So let's go over. You pointed to that so Mrs. Angie can understand. When you said make that possible, what were you referring to?
The sharp increase in oxycodone consumption in the United States would not have been possible, according to Johnson & Johnson, without the Norman poppy, the Thebaine-rich poppy.
And that you were referring to was State's Exhibit 906 that's blown up here, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, Your Honor, we're going to... Give me 1 second here. You were here when I questioned Ms. Deem Eshelman about when Johnson & Johnson sold Noramco, about where that money went, right?
Yes.
And you've had a chance to look at the parts of their 10Q filings that we discussed in court, right?
Yes.
And where did that money go?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I think this is completely outside of his expertise and also the scope of the opinions that he was designated to testify to.
Your Honor, I think there was actually a motion in limine on the very issue of this gentleman talking about the role of Johnson & Johnson in creating the entire opioid crisis, which just goes to the very heart of it. And these lawyers have stood here time and time again and said, J&J had nothing to do with Noramco. Their CEO signed a document that says quite differently.
I think counsel's mischaracterizing things, Your Honor. But the point is, he's now asking the witness to look at financial documents, publicly filed documents, and talk about financial reporting. There's been no foundation laid that he has any expertise in doing that.
May I offer a proposal? Yes. Would Janssen and Johnson stipulate that when they booked the sale of Noramco that it went to Johnson & Johnson as reflected in their 2016 Form 10Q filed under Sarbanes-Oxley with the United States government? Will they stipulate to that? And I will not ask him any more questions on that issue.
They can't properly ask this witness those questions and get that testimony. I'm happy to talk to counsel about other arrangements if there are documents that otherwise would properly be admitted, but I would consider that. But at this point, what I'm doing is simply objecting to a question that's being asked of a witness to provide an interpretation of a financial document with no foundation laid that he has any expertise to do that.
So maybe when we go to lunch, Your Honor, I would ask the court if I can visit with counsel and see if they will stipulate that what's in their public filings is
Well,
accurate.
I'm going to
Counsel
sustain
doesn't-
the objection, and if there's some other agreement, then you can present that to me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Yoder. All right, if we could turn to State's Exhibit 1048, which is in evidence, and I think this will go directly to what you're here to talk about. Again, trying to explain what these APIs do and don't do. if we could look at page 006, please. Now, you see where it says there's an opportunity for a purchaser, and it says acquire the #1 supplier of narcotic APIs in the United States, right?
Yes, that's what it says.
Now, I just want to go down to the third point. We talked earlier about the FIST article talking about naloxone and naltrexone. Do you remember that?
I do.
We'll come back to this in a minute, but can you read the third line there for the court?
Inherit a strong pipeline of new products and filed customer product opportunities.
Okay. Now, Mr. Medina, can you go to page 0007? Now, Dr. Klodny, again, we're looking at these drugs, and I think you've talked about a lot of them already. You see that several of the different drugs that Noramco or Johnson & Johnson was making API for are listed there, right?
That's correct.
Now, in this pitch book where it's being attempted to be sold, under hydromorphone, do you see a new one? We haven't talked about yet.
Naloxone,
Yes, sir.
Yes.
And it says the representative drug brand is what?
Narcan.
Can you explain to the court what Narcan is?
A Narcan or naloxone is an opioid overdose antidote. It's used to rescue someone who has stopped breathing because of an opioid overdose.
Okay, so is naloxone and Narcan an important part of, rescue medications that we need here in Oklahoma?
When death from opioid overdose becomes the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, making an antidote for an opioid overdose is essential, and so we do need lots of Narcan now.
Okay, can you turn to page 0017, Mr. Medina? So if you could blow up there. See where it says no revolutionary new narcotic? Right, so we saw naloxone and naltrexone mentioned way back in that 1998 article, right?
Yes.
And here in this pitch book, what's happened?
We're seeing naloxone listed here as well.
So this was in the 2014-2015 range, where is naloxone at that time really important?
Yes, so naloxone, I would imagine, was infrequently used, certainly infrequently used before 1996. Opioid overdoses were rare before 1996, and today it's very likely to be a very profitable product.
So if we go down to the last bullet, what does it say about buprenorphine?
Buprenorphine showing global growth for drug abuse and pain.
Your Honor, may I approach this chart?
Yeah, I think I'd like to stop for lunch.
Perfect.
If we can do that. I do need to make a record on some exhibits, so I'd invite counsel to come up and do that right now while we still have Angie. And then let's plan on resuming at 1:40. All right?
Thank you, Your Honor.